everyone, and welcome to Books in the World, production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'd like to remind us all that the Cape Cod Writers Center is in its 56th year, and it's one of the longest running writers programs in the country. This program has been on the air at least since the 80s, and we're happy to welcome authors from around the region. Today we have Anthony DAries. Hi, Anthony.
Hello.
Anthony's from Connecticut and took the drive up to the Cape, not only for Books in the World, but is also going to teach tomorrow at the Cape Cod Writers Center's Pathways program, which is a seminar system that we have, and you're going to do memoir writing, is that correct?
Yep.
Yes. Well, how appropriate, because the book that we have today is called The Language of Men, and it is your memoir of your parents, your father, your growing up years, and I totally enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're very candid, very open. I think that's a gift, and we're going to talk today about how you develop the ability to do that. I think that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Before we start talking about the book, I did want to go over a bit about your background, and you can tell us what you're doing right now and how you got here.
Yeah. So right now I direct the low residency MFA program at Western Connecticut State University. It's a low residency program in creative and professional writing. So students will focus on a creative genre like fiction or poetry or nonfiction, while also studying a professional genre like copywriting or grant writing. Before that, I worked in publishing for a while. First job out of college, I was working on college textbooks, chemistry and trigonometry textbooks, which didn't take me too long to get burnt out on.
And then I'll teach you about copy editing, though, I have a feeling.
Yes,
it's a lot of detail to deal with in something like that.
Yep, yeah, it taught me how to pay attention to detail, and it was really my first editing job. And then I worked for a small cookbook publisher in Boston called Harvard Common Press, and that was a lot more fun because it was a little more glamorous than the trigonometry textbooks.
And then you taught. You taught in a prison.
I started teaching through Penn New England's prison writing program, which has classes set up at some of the different correctional facilities in and around Boston. From there, I got a job teaching literacy full-time at the House of Correction. So I was teaching students who, anywhere between the ages of 18 and 75, but they all read below a fourth grade level.
Well, did you find any talent?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of the students that I had in the prisons were not used to having their opinions taken seriously, not used to having, especially in that environment, a space to express themselves. So, a lot of times we would just talk about books, or the guys who couldn't write would talk, tell their stories to me, and I would type them out for them, and we would reread them together. There was a great program called Fathers Read Aloud, where an incarcerated father would record himself reading a children's book and send the book and the recording to his son or daughter on the outside. So it was one of the first jobs I had that felt very necessary.
You mentioned that the prisoners, you mentioned this in your book, they're used to being told things, and they're not used to the idea that they should talk and that someone should listen to them. It was interesting.
Yeah, and as a teacher in that environment, the students, just like any other classroom, you have to build trust, but especially in that environment, because I think the students are kind of trying to figure out, well, who are you? Are you, like a caseworker or a social worker? We know you're not a correctional officer, so kind of what's your role in this place? And once the students started to realize that I wasn't, out to hurt them in any way, or, put them in some kind of compromised position, that this was actually a safe place where they could say what they needed to say, the classes became pretty popular, and there was a loyal following where they took that space seriously.
That's great. Well, Anthony being involved in prisons is just one aspect of the male experience, and your book just covers the gamut from childhood to the Vietnam War, your father, your mother's experiences, and the title, The Language of Men, is very interesting because it does give the reader a whole vocabulary of events that are so from the male point of view. This is not, as someone I read about your book says, this is not Deborah Tannen or John Gray who's telling you how to parse sentences. You're conveying experiences that are male experiences. And before we get into the book, I really just would like to read a couple of the quotes that quite well-known authors have read about your book. Now, don't blush because it's beautifully written memoir about a Vietnam vet father and the complicated legacy he leaves to his son. It's also a disturbing, brutally honest, darkly funny meditation on masculinity, violence, and sexuality. Anthony DAries is a writer to watch, and that is from no less a famous author than Tom Perrotta. And then this one is just so Andre Dubus III. I mean, the way he writes and talks, and hold the phone, kick down the door, and yell from the rooftops of all those American blue-collar towns that give birth to so many of our artists. A new one is among us, and his name is Anthony DAries. The Language of Men is a profoundly important book by a major new talent. How do you survive such praise?
I know. I can still remember getting those in an email and being, just incredible.
Have cried. I would have.
Yeah, I was really, really honored and fortunate to have their support. Yeah.
I'm sure most of the people watching this know Andre Dubus is a local hero, wrote this book called Townie about Massachusetts, and Tom Perrotta is also a Massachusetts, I think Lexington, and writes about suburban life and marriage problems, things like that. Two good books if you're looking for two good writers. So how did you get these authors to blurb your book?
I was fortunate to kind of be at some of the similar events that they were at, some of the literary events in Boston. When I started working more with Penn New England, I started getting connected with some more local writers, but really just reaching out and just asking. Tracy Kidder also wrote a blurb, and I had never met him before, but I was, just like the other authors, I was a big fan of his work. And I saw once that he was doing a short residency at Harvard, and I said, well, I'm just going to email him and see if he'll meet me for coffee. And he wrote back in 3 or 4 minutes and was like, yeah, sure. Like, I'll meet you next week.
Great. Tracy Kidder is also one of my heroes. He wrote a book about Paul Farmer.
Yes.
Mountains Beyond Mountains. I'm talking to the audience now. If you really want to know about what's going on in Haiti and some of the other countries where health care is just lacking, Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. Very good story. Well, let's go over the book in two ways. One, we'll talk about the book itself and what it covers, and the other, we'll talk about memoir writing.
Sure.
And this book is about your life and a very interesting and hard-won journey, I would say. Would you agree? That wasn't an easy task growing up.
No, yeah, there were some challenges. The book focuses a lot on my father, and he has a strong presence. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think partly when you were mentioning the title, "The Language of Men," I think the book really began in me being fascinated with my father's voice, because he, would kind of use a lot of interesting slang and. Could reference music and movies and kind of talked in this mishmash of pop culture in a lot of ways. And a lot of his language came from his time in Vietnam too. So in the very kind of immediate sense, The Language of Men is me, listening to my father and spending a lot of time interviewing him and really trying to write his voice in an unfiltered way. Each section of the book begins with a monologue in his voice, and it's completely unfiltered. And I really wanted there to be a part of the book where he was just speaking the way that I heard him.
He used the language of the movies that you watched together almost exclusively. Is that true? Is that the way he spoke?
Yeah, I mean, we could have whole conversations, in, quotes from Goodfellas or The Godfather, or, and there was this, I think what became interesting to me was that we could have a lot of conversations without really talking about much in depth.
Yeah.
So I think my entire life I felt very close to my father, but we didn't really have too many kind of sit down, heart-to-heart talks. And I think as I started to get into the book, I wanted to have those, and I wanted to capture
get
those.
That. So just go over how it starts, your trip to Vietnam, and then if you would, I would like you to read that section about where you were looking for something more about your father.
Sure, absolutely. So like I said, I think, very early essays and stories that I was writing, there was always a character that seemed to talk like my father. So I think even when I wasn't really writing nonfiction or memoir, I think I was writing about my father in some way. I knew that he had spent some time in Vietnam. He was drafted when he was 19, but I didn't know much about that experience. So I think the book started out with me just wanting to find out more about my father's experiences in the war. So I sat him down and interviewed him, and it was right around the time that he had a stroke that almost permanently damaged his ability to talk. And so there was this immediacy or this urgency to I need to talk about this, or I need to get this down before it's too late. So when I started interviewing him, I was raised not on literature, but more on music and movies, and I think Hollywood's version of the Vietnam War. So I had these expectations that my dad had this kind of secret, heroic war story that he had never told anybody. And most of his stories were about being kind of, a bored 19-year-old kid who didn't know why he was there. And a lot of his stories were about his relationships with prostitutes and taking stuff from the army base and bringing it into Saigon and selling it at for a profit, and just bringing up things that I didn't see anywhere else and I wasn't expecting, particularly the female perspective on the war. So I had done all these interviews. We sat down for several nights in a row, and I recorded them all. And he was very open. Was very, very candid, as you said. And it got to a point where I had all these stories, but I didn't know where my experience really fit into it. So I was in between jobs, and my wife, who comes from a family of mostly women and is a feminist and does a lot of work with women's health and reproductive rights, she got a job teaching health and anatomy classes to former sex workers in Vietnam. And I say this to my students a lot, but when you're writing nonfiction, a lot of times there's these moments in your life where life kind of tells you what you should be writing about, or you get these kind of clues. And that her landing that job in Vietnam gave me an opportunity to spend some time in Vietnam and retrace my father's steps and start to get my own voice into the story. And then it kind of goes on to, talk about the kind of husband that I want to be and struggle to be initially, and maybe still struggle to be sometimes. And, just as we were saying earlier, just kind of going through all the different versions of masculinity that either I inherited or was exposed to through music and movies, or, tried to emulate at some point in my life.
Why don't you read that passage? Because
Sure.
I do want the audience to get a sense of your writing. I just think it just shines in so many ways, and I would like to hear this in your own voice.
Oh, sure. Okay. Some days I concoct fantasies where an old prostitute would see me sitting on a beach, shuffle across the street, and take my hand. She tells me a story about my father, the expressions he wore as a teenager, the words he used, the plans he had. Some hidden tale that would replace the shrugs and flippant responses he gave me when I asked what he wanted to do with his life. Damned if I know. She tells me things my father had told her that he had never told anyone else. And when she takes me back to her apartment, she tells me to sit on the bed. She pulls out a dusty old book filled with my father's secrets, printed in the same chicken scratch I used to see on the notebed in our kitchen. Pick up milk, boy. I looked across the table at Vanessa, wondering where to begin.
Well, that's just a little bit, but that's what you wanted, but that's not what you got. No.
No.
Well, if anyone doesn't know that Vietnam has turned into something like a theme park for American pop culture, it's amazing information in your first chapter there. The glorification of the war, the glorification of the GI. I had no idea. No.
Yeah, I think you nailed it by saying kind of a theme park feel to it, where you can go visit some of the tunnels and pay money to shoot weapons.
To shoot weapons, yeah.
Yeah, there's bars called Apocalypse Now, and there's a lot of counterfeit or black market dog tags and American money and things that are being sold. So.
Well, after that chapter, which is really quite interesting, you structure your book, if I can think, I should ask you, but you go through your own growing up years. And this is where I think the language of men comes through. I think perhaps each chapter, a different phase of your life, taught me what boys are going through, and that's how the language comes to be known in a way. I mean, were you thinking about that? This is what boys are like.
Yeah, I think every element of the book is rooted in communication and expression, and how that's either unfiltered or filtered through some other kind of coded language. So I think part of the book where I'm in high school and growing up, and I'm kind of hanging out with these crew of guys who are kind of drinking a lot and very destructive, and I think we were proving ourselves to each other through self-destructive behavior.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of one version of masculinity that is romanticized, but then when you actually kind of experience it, it's not as glamorous as or something to strive for.
It's a little dangerous.
Yeah, and I think just kind of questioning the danger of perpetuating a stereotypical masculinity where you don't allow yourself to be vulnerable, or you don't express yourself in the moment, or where your only two forms of expression are kind of anger or humor, right?
Anger, humor, rock and roll, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Isn't that a line from
yeah
something that we both probably know?
Yeah.
There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's a place for all of that if it's questioned and understood. But when you're kind of an impressionable young kid like I was, and like I think a lot of boys are, you just start to mimic that. And I wanted to spend some time before I became a father questioning what behavior I was mimicking and what behavior was genuine. And I think that's a big part of the journey, was kind of teasing those two apart.
Well, I mentioned to you before, I thought this was a good book for women, especially women who live with boys. Some mothers are the only woman in the household, like your mother was.
Yeah.
And as you said to me, she wasn't part of the pack part of the time. You have a brother.
Yep.
And the three of you bonded in very different ways, or didn't bond, but your mother was there, but she has a very touching comment somewhere where you say she felt like she couldn't interfere in your life, and who am I to tell you what to do? Very permissive parents, right?
Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't have said this as I was growing up, but I think there is there was something to me going back and interviewing my mom and trying to figure out more about their parenting style, which I think was a bit hands-off. And in some ways that was great for us because we
Yeah.
could, we felt very independent. But I think there were moments where I think we needed a little bit of steering or
Tell a
corralling.
story about when you wrote all the curse words on your father's workbench. I mean,
Yeah.
what was that all about?
Yeah, there were moments where I think, I was a very shy kid, and I spent a lot of time observing and listening. And, I think there were moments where I was trying to get more attention. And there's one moment where, I go into my father's workshop in the garage, and I just write every curse word I can think of.
In paint or something?
Yeah,
or
in black
art?
magic marker. And in kind of my dad's typical response, he ends up grounding me, but he says, well, you got an A+ for spelling. So he was, I think even in those moments where I was trying to kind of, grab his attention, we kind of always leaned on jokes.
Yeah. You were bad. I don't know if you were always bad, but you were bad in the book.
Yeah, there are moments where there's, where sometimes there felt like there weren't any consequences.
Yeah.
And I think part of the book is getting to a point where other people in my life and myself started to kind of hold myself accountable for my behavior.
Yeah. Well, we could go on because I really love the book, and I totally recommend that people get it from Amazon or from the publisher. But I do want to leave a little bit of time to talk about memoir writing.
Sure.
Because this is such a good example. Let me just, before we forget, the Hudson Whitman Press, but if you just search for Language of Men on the internet, you'll find the book, and you'll find it on Amazon. You can download it. But talk about writing a memoir. I mean, I think the process of selecting what to include is very interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of the ongoing struggle when writing a memoir is you could include everything because you're writing about your own life, but you need to start thinking thematically at some point. And the way that I approach writing is I write scene by scene, and I'm not really concerned about transition or really a larger plot or narrative structure. I tend to just kind of crank out as many scenes as I can and then start to hold them up against each other and see what's forming. So for the book, I think once I had those 4 sections in place where it's my wife and I in Vietnam, and then back home, and then kind of growing up years, and then kind of present day at home, I started to be able to fit those scenes into those sections. I mean, in some ways the book is fairly linear, even though there's kind of flashbacks and jumping around a little bit. But, I was fortunate enough to have a really close relationship with my editor on this book, and we spent a lot of days and nights and weekends talking and emailing and really just going back and questioning each one of those scenes and deciding, is this necessary? What are these details adding to it? Have I already said this in some other way or in another scene? And so, the book, there's a lot more to the raw manuscript. There's a lot more pages. But I think part of that kind of slashing and cutting was necessary. I recently got asked, how do you know when something's finished, or how do you know when it's done?
Yeah.
Which I think is a really interesting question. But for the end of the book, there's a smaller replica of the Vietnam Wall called the Moving Wall that I think there's several of them that they move them to different towns and set them up and have events. And as I was getting towards the end of finishing the book, the Moving Wall was coming to my hometown, and my dad was volunteering at the local VA, and I think part of me decided that was going to be the end because it felt very felt like the climax of the story. So part of writing a memoir is it's almost like trying to pause a movie that can't be paused,
Yeah.
because I think once I started to realize that it's not about getting one absolute truth down, but more about embracing your own perspective and asking better questions rather than coming up with one answer, gave me some freedom that this isn't going to be the last time I write about my father. It's not going to be the last time I write about masculinity.
Okay.
So
Okay.
they're starting to realize that like this wasn't my one opportunity to write about these topics, but I really wanted to embrace the perspective that I had at the time that I was writing it.
How do you get over the fear that you're going to offend a family member?
I think the best way to get over that is to, if you can, to share some of the work with family members. I shared a draft of the book before it was published, not to have them edit anything, but just to, I didn't think there was any point in adding surprises to it. They knew the book was coming out. They were, of course, very excited. I think partly they wished it was a novel or wished I was writing about other topics. But I think through those conversations about the book, we've gotten to a place that I don't know if we would have if the book didn't exist. There's still moments where it feels raw, and there were not just conversations but fights after the book came out, and different family members took issue with different parts of the book. But I think as long as you're writing honestly and your intention is to kind of question your experience and you're not in it to attack anybody, or you're not trying to settle some kind of score, and you're not writing out of just pure anger, it's hard to argue with someone with someone's honest intention.
Well, would you believe we're out of time?
Okay.
We have we talked about a lot of things before, and I, as I've said a few times, I congratulate you on your book. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for coming. It's just been a very interesting time. As I said, I think women should read this book, and men should read it, and anybody who has a memoir in them should definitely take a look and come to one of your classes.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Anything else that you'd like to add? Just
I think we
keep writing. Put your sit down and write. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just having a consistent writing practice is usually what's worked for me.
Good.
Writing early in the morning.
Good for you. Writing early in the morning. Thank you, everyone, for listening.